Hey, welcome back everyone, Mr. Randolph here. We're going to go over another video about eukaryotic cell structures here. In this one I want to show you some of the organelles that are involved in energy conversions and some of the other ones that carry out other miscellaneous jobs. We'll just kind of throw those on at the end of this video here just so we can go over them and show you what they do. As always with these videos about eukaryotic cell structures, let's define this term organelle. If we break it apart, organ L just basically transfers to little organ. So you can think of these kind of like the organs inside of us. They're specialized structures that do certain jobs. And more formal definitions is an internal membrane-bound structure within a cell, specifically a eukaryotic cell. Remember, prokaryotic cells don't have these structures inside that are surrounded by membranes that carry out certain jobs. And so that's what an organelle is. And let's go ahead and dive into some of these ones that are used for converting energy within a cell. And so when we talk about what cells do, one of the important jobs that a cell has is to really convert energy. It allows the cell to do its jobs. It allows it to stay alive. It's one of those kind of defining characteristics of life. Anything that's considered to be alive is converting energy in some way, shape, or form. And cells use that energy to do certain things. So let's take a look at some of these energy transformers, so to say, within cells. And so the two that we're going to go over here are the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. The mitochondria are these little blue organelles in this kind of sketch right here, and you can see that these are in an animal cell. They're also over here in a plant cell, and so mitochondria are going to be found in all eukaryotic cells. They're a really, really important organelle that you find in all eukaryotic organisms. And then the chloroplasts are actually only found in a couple of organisms. We're definitely going to find them in plants. And so over here, let's see, where's our chloroplast? It's going to be this right here, and then that chloroplast is broken down in this image into two different parts. We're going to find a chloroplast in the cells of any organisms that carry out photosynthesis. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. Let's look at the mitochondria first. A lot of times when you learn about the mitochondria, it's been called the powerhouse of the cell. I know you probably heard it referred to as the mighty mitochondria. Always think about mighty, using energy kind of a thing. It's those little tools to help you remember that the mitochondria's job is really to produce energy that the cell can use. That's why cells need mitochondria. And really, to do that, it's going to break down food molecules to release energy. And it uses that energy, or it takes that energy and converts it into another form that cells can use through a process called cellular respiration. I go into that in a lot more detail in some other videos, so if you're curious about how that happens, please go check those out, or go learn a little bit about what cellular respiration is. But this is where that happens. That conversion of the glucose that we eat, or the sugars that we eat, we use that to make energy that our cells can use. That happens here within the mitochondria. And so here's just a kind of a sketch or an illustration of it. This over here is actually an electron microscope view of a mitochondria. We can see that it is incredibly small, about the size of bacterial cells. And so there's a theory called endosymbiosis that says that the mitochondria may actually have originated or started off as a prokaryotic organism that was somehow engulfed into a cell and then just became part of that cell. And so what we see today is these mitochondria in cells. They have their own DNA, which kind of supports that theory. And so I'll do a video on endosymbiosis to kind of go into that in a little more detail. But for this, I want you to know that this is where that energy is produced. And so we can see all of these folded membrane lines within here. On each one of those is where a lot of this chemical reaction happens that breaks down sugars and turns them into usable energy for cells, this molecule called ATP. And so that happens here in the mitochondria. Yet another view of a mitochondria here within a cell, and so this is where that takes place. So what happens is, within the grass or the plants that are eaten, that sugar gets broken down, absorbed by cells, and then converted into that ATP energy within the mitochondria. This also happens in plants. Plants break down some of that sugar as well. Protists and fungi, all of those eukaryotic cells have the mitochondria in it, and it produces the energy. Chloroplasts. So let's talk about chloroplasts. These are where photosynthesis happens. So any kind of photosynthetic organism, some algae that go through photosynthesis, and plants that carry out photosynthesis will have chloroplasts in them. And what they do, their job is to take the energy that is absorbed from light and use that to create sugars. And so they use that light energy and they go through a process called photosynthesis and produce sugars. This happens in that chloroplast, and those sugars then are used for a lot of different things. In some cases, they're sent over to the mitochondria in a plant, where they get broken down through cellular respiration and produce energy the plant can use. Some of those sugars get used to build the cell wall. Watch the video over cell structures that provide structure and support, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the chloroplast is where that sugar is produced. They're green because of some of the pigmentation within them. And in the video that I do going over photosynthesis, I talk a little bit about that as well. So that's the job of the chloroplast. Oh, here, we'll talk about it now. The green pigment called chlorophyll is actually absorbing the blue and red wavelengths of light and using that energy to produce the sugars. It doesn't use the green wavelength, and so that green is reflected, and that's why the chlorophyll looks green. And the green parts of plants are where most of that chlorophyll is stored, and so that's why leaves and some of the stems of plants are green, because they have a lot of that chlorophyll going through photosynthesis. Lysosomes. Lysosomes are kind of indirectly related to that energy conversion within cells. I like talking about them when we do this because of their role, but they serve kind of a general role of just breaking down things. But some of the food and some of the molecules that cells absorb actually get broken down a little bit within the lysosome so that they can eventually be broken down further by the mitochondria to produce energy. And so here we see this lysosome is illustrated here as kind of this little ball. And so these lysosomes are floating throughout the cells in random places all throughout the cytoplasm, and their job is to take in these molecules and these things that need to be broken down further and help break those apart. So let me show you a little kind of simple illustration on how this happens. And so we have a lysosome here, and it has these proteins, or really enzymes, within the lysosome. Well, that lysosome is going to be really important for breaking down this large food molecule that the cell needs to use for energy. And so the lysosome will come and it'll attach to that big, large food molecule and release the enzymes, which then go in and break that down. And so it breaks it into smaller pieces, which can then be digested further by the mitochondria so the cell can get energy. Sometimes lysosomes will digest broken down organelles. So in this case, we have a mitochondria here that has stopped functioning. It's no longer working. And so the lysosomes that have enzymes that can break that down come, again, attach to it, release their enzymes, and digest all the pieces of the mitochondria. So they get broken down and can be reused for something else. Also, sometimes lysosomes are used in breaking down dead cells. So a cell might release some lysosomes to go and attach to a worn out cell or broken down cell, or possibly a cell that needs to be digested because it's an invading cell, or for whatever reason. The lysosomes again attach, release their enzymes, and those enzymes go in and digest that cell. And so that's another organelle that's useful for cells. You go back really quick. Let me show you how we break this word apart. Lys, or Lys, is a prefix, and we'll see this in a lot of different places here. But in science, if I have that prefix lys, that means to break apart. And so a lysosome is used to break apart things, and so that's the job of that. So let's look at some other of the miscellaneous organelles that we just haven't gone over and just want to talk about here. So we have some that are used for storage. We talked about lysosomes breaking things down. Well, in some cases, some molecules need to be stored. And so cells have these organelles called vacuoles, which are very similar to lysosomes. They're this membrane kind of sac that's used to store materials. Well, in plants, they have normal vacuoles, which store food particles and some other broken down parts of organelles that could be used later. But plant cells also have this very large vacuole right here. This large vacuole holds water. And that large vacuole within a plant cell, as it fills with water, kind of gives the plant cell its rigidity. And so let's take a look at how that happens. So that large vacuole, if it's got too much water, pushes everything out up against the cell wall here. And in some cases, if it does that too much, it can cause the cell to die. Normally, what you want is your large vacuole to have enough water in it so that the cell is full, but not pushing up against the cell wall. That's what we call flaccid. That's the way that the plant cell wants to be. And when that happens, our plants stand up nice and tall and look like they're happy and growing and doing everything they need to. If a plant runs out of water, that large vacuole loses all the water, and the plant becomes what we call plasmolyzed. When we talk about the movement of water in and out of cells, I'll go into more detail about what this means. We do a lab where we plasmolyze some cells, but it causes the cell to shrivel up, and that's when we see the plants do this. But that's because of the large vacuole inside the plant cell. Animal cells do have vacuoles. They don't do that same kind of job. They typically store food particles so they can be digested later. They'll store other things that the cell just needs to be kept for a while. And so they hold those within that membrane called a vacuole. The last one that I'd like to talk to you guys about is cilia. Cilia are these little small hair-like structures on the outsides of some single-celled organisms and other cells. And what those cilia do is they help the cell move around within the liquid or fluid that's around it. It's used for locomotion or used for moving. So cilia are these little small hair-like structures on this paramecium that we can see here. And then what we also have, another tool that cells use for movement, is what's called a flagella. And it's this tail-like, whip-like structure here that you'll see on some single-celled organisms that's used to actually move that cell. It kind of helps it swim. We see that on sperm cells within animals. So the flagella and the cilia are some of those organelles that are used, or I wouldn't call them an organelle because they're not a membrane-bound kind of thing, but they are structures that cells use for movement. So hopefully this video cleared up some of the organelles that are used for producing energy within cells, and some of those organelles or structures that allow cells to move and do other specialized jobs like storage and breaking down materials within cells.